Two scenes, seemingly impossible to reconcile, existed merely a few hundred meters from each other on the edges of Remscheid during April of 1945. The first was a chaotic sprawl of destroyed trenches and crumbled brick structures scattered with charred Panzerfaust tubes, ripped Hitler Youth armbands, and the school satchels that boys had brought into combat as though they were seasoned soldiers instead of mere children. The second was a commandeered schoolhouse where American nurses, their faces marked with the grime of exhaustion and their aprons rigid with dried antiseptic, boiled water in enamel containers and arranged bandages across desks that had once supported arithmetic primers. The juxtaposition felt almost staged, as if warfare itself sought to demonstrate what it inflicted upon youth and what those young lives required in response. Within this stark contrast, the narrative quietly commenced. Corporal Samuel Pierce led the initial group of juvenile captives toward the structure, his military boots grinding across the shattered fragments of a blackboard that had been blasted into the street. The boys trailing behind him moved like phantoms, their eyes displaying a vacant awareness that had no place on features so tender and malnourished. They numbered 11, 12, 15 years at the most, too mature to be infants, too delicate to be combatants, and too traumatized to maintain any pretense. Pierce continuously glanced backward, not from apprehension but from sheer incredulity. Mere hours previously, these identical boys had been discharging sporadic rounds from behind a demolished stone barrier, thoroughly convinced that American forces would massacre them should they attempt capitulation. Now they advanced with hands elevated only to shoulder level, depleted beyond any capacity for resistance, partially limping, partially drifting. Within the schoolhouse, Nurse Evelyn Grant detected their presence before visual confirmation. A shuffling of diminutive boots, the uncertain murmuring of German syllables, the unmistakable rhythm of terror woven through respiration. She had maintained her post for 18 consecutive hours. Yet something within the cadence of those approaching footsteps compelled her to straighten. She swept back an errant lock of hair and positioned herself in the entrance precisely as the procession of boys materialized. The initial child regarded her apron as though it constituted a weapon. The second fixed his gaze upon the floor. The third stared at absolutely nothing. The atmosphere carried the scent of damp wool, medical disinfectant, and residual smoke drifting from the hillsides where artillery had ceased only that very morning. Pierce gestured toward them with a helpless motion. "Additional strays," he muttered, though he recognized the term lacked accuracy. Strays selected their trajectories. These boys had been thrust into theirs. Evelyn approached with deliberate slowness, cautious to avoid abrupt gestures. Her primary observation was the trembling, subtle, unsteady contractions in hands that still bore traces of mud embedded beneath their fingernails. Her secondary observation was the starvation inscribed upon their countenances, skin stretched taut across cheekbones, lips fissured, eyes glazed with the unmistakable appearance of those who had consumed inadequate nourishment for multiple days. She raised her palms, demonstrating she possessed nothing. "Es ist in Ordnung," she articulated softly. "Ihr seid sicher." The German wasn't flawless, but it proved sufficient for the foremost child in the queue to glance upward, startled. They processed into the schoolhouse individually, and with each advance the contrast intensified. Here, arrangements of metallic trays containing sterilized implements. There, boys whose knuckles bore bruises from gripping firearms excessively large for their frames. Here, a chalk illustration of human anatomy hastily repurposed as a medical assessment diagram. There, children who had never studied anatomy because their instructors had been conscripted. War had perverted every principle until this moment felt simultaneously surreal and unavoidable. Evelyn guided the smallest boy toward a desk. His leg exhibited visible tremors, and when she elevated his trouser hem, she discovered a slender fragment of shrapnel lodged just above the ankle. The surrounding tissue appeared inflamed and infected. He recoiled. She waited, permitting silence to establish itself before reaching again. His breathing caught, but he permitted her to commence cleansing the injury. She perceived the terror within his muscles. Terror not of physical pain, but of what he believed she represented. Propaganda had instructed him that American medical personnel poisoned the wounded. She could observe the internal struggle manifested across his features, the impulse to withdraw battling against the necessity for relief. Behind her, Sergeant Lewis transported another boy to a cot, this one unconscious from hemorrhaging. "They persist in arriving," he complained, though his tone held no irritation, only disbelief. "Command indicates there might be hundreds more concealed in the forests." Evelyn acknowledged with a nod, but maintained her focus on the boy before her. He attempted stillness, but tears accumulated at the corners of his vision. His lips formed a whisper she barely captured. "Warum helfen Sie uns? Why are you assisting us?" She refrained from immediate response. She applied antiseptic, secured gauze, and allowed the straightforward act of medical care to communicate until his breathing stabilized sufficiently to permit her reply. "Because you're injured," she stated finally, "and because you're children." The boy regarded her, then truly examined her with a fragile bewilderment that seemed older than his years. His hand secured the edges of the desk as if anchoring himself to something that wouldn't vanish. Outside, a distant rumbling of engines signaled another convoy of prisoners arriving. Inside, the schoolhouse seemed suspended between dual realities, the one that had compelled these boys to fight and the one that insisted upon recognizing them as human. When Evelyn completed his bandaging, he didn't release her wrist. His fingers tightened just enough for her to register the plea beneath the contact. He leaned nearer, his voice so faint it might have been mistaken for exhalation. "Du bist jetzt meine Mutti? You're my mother now?" The chamber fell silent. A nurse folding bandages paused mid-action. Pierce lowered the canteen he had been offering another boy. The child's declaration hung there, fragile and devastating, a confession born not of manipulation but of total collapse. Fear, isolation, and indoctrination dissolving in the presence of compassion. Evelyn froze for merely a heartbeat, but it proved sufficient to register the magnitude of what he had articulated. She understood he didn't intend it literally. He meant something far more desperate. "I no longer know what to believe. Don't abandon me." She compressed his hand gently, acknowledging the truth without pretending she could adequately address it. Before she could verbalize a response, a medic burst through the entrance. "Additional incoming," he announced breathlessly. "Dozens, perhaps 50. Some can scarcely walk." Evelyn looked at the boy, whose grip intensified as though he feared she would evaporate. In his eyes, she witnessed the conflict at the heart of the war's concluding days. A generation trained for killing, now pleading with strangers for security. And outside, the footsteps of additional children approached, carrying their own unspoken confessions toward the sole location remaining that resembled mercy. The schoolhouse felt increasingly confined with every hour that elapsed, its corridors resonating with the uneasy hum of fear, relief, and the murmur of foreign languages. It sounded excessively soft for a battlefield. By sunrise, the initial wave of boys had been nourished, bandaged, or coaxed into uneasy slumber, but the deeper wounds, the ones propaganda had carved, remained raw and festering. Evelyn Grant sensed them most acutely when she walked past the desks converted into improvised beds. The children observed her with an intensity that unsettled even her seasoned composure, their eyes tracking her as though losing sight of her meant losing safety itself. Outside, trucks maintained their arrivals. The Ninth Army was sweeping through the final pockets of resistance, gathering fighters who barely reached the height of their weapons. As each group entered the courtyard, Nurses prepared themselves for the identical sequence: the flinch when an American approached, the trembling when water was offered, the hesitation at the sight of medical instruments. It wasn't pain they feared, but deception, poison masquerading as kindness, a trap disguised as assistance. These were lessons hammered into them by instructors who had either fled or fallen, leaving their students armed with fear instead of guidance. Evelyn encountered this fear again when she approached a thin boy huddled beneath a broken coat rack. He stared rigidly at her canteen, refusing to accept it even after an interpreter repeated her reassurance. Only when another boy drank first did he allow the water near his lips. His reluctance wasn't unusual. Some refused food until they saw nurses consume from the same pot. Others needed to smell every item, searching for the toxins they'd been warned about. That level of indoctrination didn't vanish with a kindly word. It dissolved slowly, like frost under weak spring sunlight. Corporal Pierce, moving between triage areas, shook his head at the sight. "They think we're monsters," he muttered, but his voice held more sorrow than anger. Pierce had nephews back home, boys who spent their days playing baseball or fishing, not hiding in ruined factories with rifles that outweighed them. Watching these German children tremble at the sound of English words carved a hollow in him he couldn't articulate. The conflict intensified when a fresh group of captives arrived just before midday, escorted by soldiers whose expressions betrayed both exhaustion and disbelief. These boys were even younger, several no older than 10, and their fear was sharper, edged with the kind of panic that came from witnessing things they were too young to comprehend. One stared wildly at the Red Cross armband, whispering frantically that it marked someone who harvested organs. Another tried to crawl under a desk, convinced he would be beaten for surrendering. Evelyn knelt beside the second boy, her knees stiff from hours on the wooden floor. She spoke quietly, offering a small piece of chocolate from her pocket. At first he recoiled, but the scent of cocoa, something so far removed from the stale ration bread he knew, pulled his gaze toward her hand. His fingers shook as he reached for it. When he tasted it, he broke into silent tears, confusion blending with relief in a way that twisted her heart. Nearby, Sergeant Lewis was speaking with another nurse, his voice low. "Some of the GIs are asking why we're treating them like this," he said. "They saw these kids firing Panzerfaust yesterday." The nurse didn't respond immediately. The truth was complicated. The boys had fired because adults told them to, because surrender meant torture, or so they believed, because running with a weapon was the only identity handed to them after years of propaganda that replaced childhood with duty. Evelyn overheard fragments of the conversation, but her attention remained on the children. She noticed how they clustered not around soldiers but around nurses, drawn to the voices that did not bark commands. She saw how they tracked every tiny movement she made, terrified she might vanish and leave them adrift in a world that had lied to them too often. And beneath all of it, she felt the weight of their unspoken question. Who are we if the enemy is kinder than the people who raised us? The emotional strain mounted as exhaustion crept into her bones. At one point, she stepped into the hallway to catch her breath. The walls, once painted a cheerful yellow, were stained with soot, fingerprints, and patches of plaster torn by explosions. A child's drawing, a stick figure with a red flag, remained pinned above a row of coat hooks, a haunting reminder of what this building had been before war twisted it into a sanctuary for the lost. Her moment of stillness ended when a medic hurried toward her, carrying a small boy who was unconscious and drenched in sweat. "Fever spiking," he said. "Maybe pneumonia?" Evelyn snapped back into motion, clearing space, shouting for blankets, checking his pulse. His eyelashes fluttered as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. When he finally opened his eyes, he whispered something she didn't understand. Another boy nearby translated in hesitant English. He asks if you will kill him fast." The words landed like a physical blow. Evelyn leaned closer, her voice steady only because she forced it to be. "No harm will come to you," she said. "Not from us." The boy studied her face for a long moment as if trying to determine whether truth could be recognized by sight alone. His breathing slowed, and he drifted back into fragile sleep. As the hours stretched, the nurses worked with an intensity that blurred one task into the next. Trust formed in tiny increments. A boy offering his arm for a vaccination without flinching, another shyly handing Evelyn a button he had carried in his pocket. These gestures, small as they were, signaled the unraveling of a belief system that had shaped them for years. But even as hope flickered, the weight of care pressed harder. Near dusk, Pierce returned from the courtyard with grim news. More juvenile fighters had been captured, far more than expected. The schoolhouse, already strained, would soon overflow. Evelyn felt the shift immediately, a tightening in the air, a sense that the fragile progress made within these walls could crack under the pressure of what was coming. She looked at the room filled with children who trusted her now, if only cautiously. They were calmer but still fragile, still afraid of losing the single point of safety they had found. And as another engine rumbled outside, signaling yet another convoy, a chilling thought crossed her mind. The hardest part had not yet begun. By the third day, the schoolhouse no longer resembled a clinic but a pressure chamber where every breath carried the weight of hunger, fear, and the relentless stream of young prisoners arriving faster than the nurses could tend them. The corridors overflowed with cots fashioned from doors and blankets, each one holding a boy who looked too small for the rifle he had carried only days before. Evelyn felt the shift the moment she stepped inside that morning. The air itself seemed thinner, strained by need. Even the light through the cracked windows looked weary, as if exhausted by illuminating so much suffering. The crisis began with something deceptively simple: food. The children were starving in ways that went beyond the physical. Their bodies shook not just from malnutrition but from a fear so deeply implanted that even nourishment felt dangerous. When the quartermaster's team delivered crates of sea rations and powdered milk, the boys eyed them with suspicion, certain they hid some terrible trick. A few refused to touch the meals entirely. Others devoured them too quickly, only to fall ill minutes later, their weakened stomachs unable to manage the sudden abundance. Evelyn moved from cot to cot with a basin, soothing them through violent cramps and nausea, all while knowing the meals they rejected could not be replaced quickly. In the cramped kitchen, Sergeant Lewis argued with a logistics officer who insisted supplies were being stretched thin across the entire division. "These aren't soldiers," Lewis snapped, lowering his voice only when he realized several boys were listening. "They're children. They need different food. Softer food." The officer promised to send porridge ingredients, but his tone carried doubt, and the conversation ended with no real certainty. Evelyn overheard the last line as she passed. "You'll have to make do." She felt those words settle on her shoulders like another burden. The emotional strain began to show in the children as well. The smallest ones clustered around the nurses, refusing to be separated even long enough for their bandages to be changed. One boy followed Evelyn everywhere, tugging lightly at her apron whenever she walked too far. Another refused to sleep unless she sat beside him, his eyes darting open in panic whenever she shifted. It became clear that the propaganda drilled into them had not only taught them to fear the enemy, it had left them unable to navigate safety when it finally arrived. They clung to the nurses because they had no idea how to stand on their own. As more boys arrived, the tension tightened. Some carried superficial wounds but deep psychological fractures. One boy broke into hysterics when a medic tried to remove his torn boots, screaming that the Americans would cut off his feet. Another curled into a ball and refused to move, convinced that surrender meant he would never see daylight again. Evelyn sat beside him for nearly an hour, speaking softly until his breathing slowed enough for him to uncurl. She had no training in trauma psychology, yet she became the anchor they all reached for. The one consistent presence in a world that had shifted too violently, too fast. The chaos reached a breaking point that afternoon. A supply delay left the kitchen nearly barren, save for a few cans of soup and the powdered milk reserved for the youngest. When Evelyn tried to ration it, two older boys began arguing, each insisting the other take more. Their voices escalated into frantic shouting, the kind born from fear rather than greed. She stepped between them, one hand on each trembling shoulder, and eased them apart until the panic in their eyes dimmed. But she felt the fragility in that moment, the awareness that even kindness could not shield them from the gnawing truth that resources were dwindling. Outside, orders arrived for a second triage tent to be erected, though there were barely enough medics to staff the first. Corporal Pierce hammered wooden stakes into the ground while muttering under his breath about the surreal nature of treating enemy combatants who were too light to lift their own gear. He paused when Evelyn approached, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. "How long can we keep this up?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't know. Inside, the air seemed to thicken as evening approached. The smell of disinfectant mixed with that of thin soup and unwashed uniforms. Boys cried softly in their sleep, calling out for mothers who would not come. Evelyn found herself lingering at their bedsides longer than necessary, brushing hair from foreheads, murmuring reassurances she hoped they would believe. She noticed how some boys offered tiny tokens of gratitude, a torn button, a scrap of ribbon, even a pebble they had carried through the ruins. Each gift felt like a small surrender of fear. But beneath these moments lay an unspoken dread. The schoolhouse was reaching its limit. There were too many children, too few supplies, too little time to turn panic into trust. The nurses moved like lanterns in a gathering storm, casting fragile light against the encroaching darkness of uncertainty. Evelyn felt it each time she paused, sensing the invisible line between stability and collapse. Near dusk, she discovered a boy slumped against the wall near the stairwell. His lips were pale, his breathing shallow. When she lifted him gently onto a cot, he whispered that he had not eaten in 3 days because he feared the food would change him into a traitor. The revelation struck her harder than she expected. She realized that for all the battles these boys had escaped, the one inside their minds had not ended. She coaxed him to take a spoonful of broth, holding the bowl steady as his hands shook uncontrollably. When he finished, he leaned against her arm with a trust so sudden it nearly broke her composure. The schoolhouse grew quieter as night settled, but the exhaustion never softened. Evelyn walked through the dim corridor, lantern in hand, checking each child one last time. She saw fear easing in some, tightening in others, but always present beneath the surface. When she reached the final cot, the smallest boy, the one who had called her moody, stirred in his sleep and murmured her name. She brushed his forehead gently, wondering how many more would arrive tomorrow. Then, as she stepped into the entryway, she heard the low rumble of engines outside. Not one truck, several. Pierce rushed in, his face grim. "Another convoy," he said. "Twice as many as before." He hesitated, then added the words she had dreaded without admitting. "And they're all children." The order arrived shortly after dawn, delivered by a lieutenant whose expression made clear he expected resistance. The juvenile prisoners, every boy sheltered inside the schoolhouse, were to be transferred to a newly organized holding camp several miles east. The directive was brief, clinical, stamped with an urgency that left no room for debate. Yet when Evelyn read it, her pulse tightened. She looked at the rows of cots, at the thin hands clutching blankets, at the fragile trust that had taken days to build. Moving them would mean tearing open wounds that had only begun to close. Corporal Pierce noticed her silence. "Orders are orders," he said softly, though his voice carried none of the usual certainty. "They'll have proper facilities there, schooling, food, structure." He paused, watching a boy struggle to tie his shoe with trembling fingers. "But it won't be you." The announcement spread through the schoolhouse like a cold wind. Some boys reacted with blank incomprehension, unable to process the meaning. Others panicked immediately, clinging to nurses or hiding beneath desks. A few simply stared at the floor, shoulders curling inward as though bracing for a blow. Propaganda had taught them surrender meant imprisonment. Imprisonment meant disappearance, and disappearance meant death. For 3 brief days, the nurses had broken that chain of belief. Now, to the boys, it looked as if the chain was being reattached. Evelyn moved from child to child, kneeling, reassuring, holding small hands that shook with terror. She told them they would be fed, clothed, and treated well. She promised they would be together, but they weren't asking about each other. They were asking about her. Would she come? Would she stay with them? Would she return? Their questions clung to her like burrs, each one snagging on something deep inside. The transfer began under a pale morning sun. Military police formed orderly lines, doing their best to appear gentle, though the very sight of their uniforms made several boys recoil. Trucks waited in the courtyard, canvas flaps swaying in the wind. One by one, the children were guided toward them. Some walked stiffly, resigned. Others went only after being coaxed by nurses who forced smiles they didn't feel. The smallest boy, the one who had whispered Mutti, refused to move at all. He wrapped both arms around Evelyn's waist, burying his face in her apron, shaking so hard she could feel the tremors through her ribs. She lifted him carefully, whispering into his hair that he was safe, that she would not let harm come to him, that this was not a punishment. But his fear did not ease. His sobs were silent, the kind that hollow the chest and burn the eyes. When she finally carried him outside, his grip tightened to the point of pain. She didn't pry him off. She simply waited until exhaustion loosened his hold. The trucks rumbled to life. Dust rose as canvas flaps were secured. The boys looked out from the openings, wide eyes, clenched jaws, expressions too old and too young all at once. A few reached out with weak hands, as if trying to bridge the distance growing between them and the nurses. Evelyn stepped closer, brushing fingers against theirs whenever she could reach. It was a small gesture, but for many of them it was the final confirmation that the kindness they'd received was real, not a trick. When the vehicles pulled away, a hush fell over the courtyard. It felt as if someone had exhaled slowly, letting a fragile world collapse inward. Evelyn watched the convoy turn down the road and disappear behind a line of shattered trees. Only when the last engine faded did she allow herself to lower her head. Pierce stood nearby, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Words seemed pointless. War had a way of taking moments of humanity and scattering them without ceremony. Hours later, when the schoolhouse was nearly empty, Evelyn found herself cleaning the corridors automatically, picking up buttons the boys had dropped, smoothing blankets no one would sleep under again. The silence pressed against her ears. Without the children's anxious muttering, the building felt abandoned, its walls echoing with ghosts of lessons once taught and illusions once lived. She paused at a desk where one boy had drawn a clumsy stick figure holding a nurse's hand. The sketch, made in pencil so faint it was nearly invisible, felt more devastating than any wound she had dressed. That afternoon, she received permission to visit the holding camp. The journey was short but silent, the jeep bouncing over rutted roads lined with collapsed farmhouses and half-buried artillery shells. When they reached the camp, a guard escorted her through rows of tents erected with military precision. Inside, the children sat in groups, some eating, some staring at the ground, some whispering among themselves. They looked smaller here, swallowed by the scale of the compound. The smallest boy spotted her first. He sprang to his feet, stumbling toward her with such urgency that the nearest guard instinctively stepped back. He clung to her hand, pressing it to his cheek, relief flooding his features with a softness she had never seen in him before. Several other boys approached quietly, cautiously, as if afraid she might dissolve into mist if they reached too quickly. She stayed with them as long as she could, checking dressings, smoothing hair, offering smiles that were steadier now that she could see they were safe. A camp chaplain approached, nodding gently toward the children. "Kids adapt faster than men," he said. "They learn the truth the moment someone actually shows it to them." His voice held no judgment, only understanding born of too many months tending defeated souls. As Evelyn prepared to leave, the smallest boy tugged her sleeve. His eyes held a question he couldn't shape into words, a question she couldn't fully answer. She knelt, pressing his hand between both of hers. "You're going to be all right," she whispered. "Eat, rest, grow. That is your job now." He nodded, though the uncertainty in his gaze remained. When she stepped outside, the camp's perimeter buzzed with new activity. Another transport arriving, another group of children taken alive from a war meant for men. Evelyn paused, breath catching as she saw them. More young faces hollowed by fear, stepping into a place where mercy might reshape them. And in that instant, she understood a truth that settled deep in her chest, heavy and immovable. The war's end had not ended anything at all.